It's the Opperman Report. Join digital forensic investigator and PI Ed Opperman for an in-depth discussion of conspiracy theories, strategy of New World Order resistance, high-profile court cases in the news, and interviews with expert guests and authors on these topics and more. It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. You could find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting through my website, emailrevealer.com. But the best way right now is to just email me directly at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. Our guest today is Joseph McBride. He's a very prolific author, and he's also a college professor, I believe, on film. Written 24 books, many varied topics. And most recent one was on Billy Wilder, Dancing on the Edge, with Billy Wilder, the notorious famous film director. But also, too, he's an expert on the JFK assassination, written a couple of books on that. The one we'll be talking about today mostly is called Into the Nightmare: My Search for the Killers of President John F. Kennedy and Officer J.D. Tippit. You may not recall, but many people may not be aware, but there was a death, too, of a police officer who was shot there, too, that day in Dallas as well. And good old Lee Harvey Oswald was alleged to have committed that crime as well. Another book on the Kennedy assassination he wrote is Political Truth, the Media and the Assassination of President Kennedy. Mr. Joseph McBride, are you there?
Yeah. Hi, Ed.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
great. Thank you so much. Tell the audience about yourself. Who is Joseph McBride?
Well, the reason I spent most of my life researching the Kennedy assassination is that I worked for John F. Kennedy as a kid. I was 12 years old in 1960. I was a volunteer in his Wisconsin primary campaign. And I got to meet him a couple times, and I was very inspired by him. And I wanted to become a politician, a lawyer and politician. But when he was killed, I lost my faith in the political system, and it turned me into a writer instead. My parents were newspaper reporters in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and so I've always been a journalist since 1960. As a matter of fact, the first article I published in a magazine came out in May 1960, the same week that I got a letter from Kennedy thanking me for my work on the campaign. Very, very thoughtful of him. And I met him again in 62 when he was president. He came to Milwaukee again. And so my first writing on the assassination was October 1961, 2 years before it happened. I wrote a short story for my high school English class called The Plot Against a Country. I was concerned about his lack of security, which I saw at close range. I think what inspired me the most was I took my Brownie camera and I took a close-up picture of him with a flashbulb. I rather rudely stuck my camera 3 feet from his face at a big political rally in Milwaukee and blew off this flashbulb, and he winced, but he quickly recovered. He was such a good politician. He smiled, but I felt really embarrassed. But it made me aware of he didn't have much security, very little at all. And I was also a student of the Lincoln assassination. I've always been fascinated by history, and so I kind of knew about assassinations. And so when he was killed, I wasn't completely surprised. I ran to a radio. I was in my high school cafeteria, and I ran to a radio in a drugstore 2 blocks away and listened to the first reports. And I think that was very valuable. I recommend that to people if anything terrible happens. Get to a television or radio as soon as possible, because some of the early reports, contrary to the widespread opinion, are more accurate than some later reports when they have time to start changing the story. And in the first, I started listening at 12:40. It happened at 12:30, and for 20 minutes they said the shots came from the front, from the railroad bridge or the hill in the front, which we now call the grassy knoll. And then at 1 o'clock they started saying all the shots came from behind, from a building called the Texas School Book Depository. And my journalistic antennae went up, since I was already a journalist. If they change a story without explaining why, I start thinking something is wrong. And by the end of the day, I was not believing the emerging story that Oswald had done at all. And I listened to him. I saw him say he didn't shoot anybody and he was just a patsy, etc. So I spent, I spent about 31 years on Into the Nightmare off and on. I mean, I always have a lot of other things going on at the same time, but I began seriously researching the case in 1982. I was more casually researching it before that, and so since 82, I've been, I research it all the time. I read all the new books, and I keep up on documents, etc. And I did this second book. I did Into the Nightmare in 2013 for the 50th anniversary. I finally got it done, and then I did another book, Political Truth, that you mentioned. It came out last December, and I'm very proud of that. I think we have a serious problem with the mainstream media not telling the truth about that case and about some of the other things. And part of my point in the book is that has contributed to the schism we have in our country now of half the public believes one version of reality and half believes the other, which is a dangerous situation, as we could see with claims the election was stolen and the attack on the Capitol, et cetera. It's a big, urgent national issue. So
it's really terrifying because now you have people supposedly having a debate or an argument or a discussion, but mainly, really, all they're doing is repeating the talking points that they either heard from Fox or CNN back and forth. They're just repeating exactly what they heard. What do you think it is? You wrote a whole book about the media and the assassination. What do you think it is that can corral the whole media to put forth one account?
Well, there are a number of reasons for it, but one is that the CIA has long been involved with the media. Carl Bernstein of Woodward Bernstein fame wrote a piece in 1977 in Rolling Stone, which you can read on his website, called "The CIA and the Media," and he reported that about 400 members of the media were either working for the CIA in some capacity or funneling information to them or getting information from them clandestinely, and which is a serious concern because they're propagandizing rather than seeking the truth. And the outlets that he blamed as most heavily permeated by the CIA were the New York Times, CBS, and Time Incorporated, Time Life. He didn't go into his own paper, the Washington Post, very much, but they've always been kind of a CIA outlet. Now it used to be covert, now it's more overt. But that's part of the problem. But a lot of reporters back then, especially, they had been through World War II, for example, and they were used to government censorship and trusting the government. One thing I go into in my book is when I was a kid, we believed what the government said. We were naive. Maybe not everybody did, but I did. And, when Eisenhower was caught lying about the U-2 plane in 1960, it was a big shock. Oh, my God, the president lies. That's really shocking. And it rattled people. Now, if presidents tell the truth, it's kind of a shock. I mean, under Biden, it's better than under Trump, but he lied all the time. But we're used to politicians not telling the truth or shading the truth, and that's a serious problem. And so that's one of the issues. A lot of reporters still think of themselves as doing the business of the government as if they're part of the government. They use the word "we" for the government, and there are other things too. Like access is really important to the media. If you're a reporter for a major outlet and you're reporting something that doesn't fit the official story, they will stop calling on you or taking your phone calls. And if that happens too often, you lose your position. Helen Thomas, who was a very good reporter, people will remember, she died a few years ago, but she was the UPI White House correspondent for a long time, and she started questioning the Iraq War, and they stopped calling on her. She used to sit in the front row at the briefings, and after they stopped calling on her outlet, the Hearst papers dropped her, and she wound up working for some suburban, throwaway paper in the Washington area because she was asking inconvenient questions. That's a powerful incentive because, for example, my parents were middle-class people. with 7 kids, and they didn't make a lot of money. They were honest journalists, and there wasn't a lot of money in it back then. And now a lot of reporters get very well paid. Of course, a lot of newspapers have gone under, et cetera, and people are unemployed. But the people who work for the big outlets get very good salaries, and if you work for a TV network, some people get really, really large salaries, and they're not about to jeopardize that to take an unpopular position. But when I say unpopular position, then we'll move on to other things. But the public consistently, according to the head of the Gallup poll, said a few years ago that the public is consistently, by about 70%, not believe the Warren report, saying one man shot both Kennedy and Tippit. I often joke that the other 30% are the media, basically, So the public is ahead of the media on that score, so that's another reason that contributes to the skepticism people have about government, which is a good thing in some ways, but if carried to extremes can be problematical if you don't believe anything anymore. What are you going to think,
Interesting. I remember growing up in New York, Alan Combs was a stand-up comedian. Remember Alan Combs used to co-host with Sean Hannity there on Fox for a while? He was
he was their token liberal there.
Right. And, this guy was an expert on JFK. He was an authority on JFK. He would talk about it at the nightclubs. And, this guy knew everything. The Umbrella Man, this guy knew details. This was before the internet, so this guy knew details that I had never heard before. And I grew up with A.J. Webman, who wrote Coup d'etat in America. So what do you call it? But when you put him on TV, I never heard of it. Not a word.
Yeah. Yeah, they know not to bring up certain subjects. Another one is 9/11. These are the third rails of American journalism. If you start questioning those stories, and 9/11 is full of a lot of strange inconsistencies and things. But they're kind of off limits to the media if you're on the Washington Post or New York Times. This book, Political Truth, I made an effort in the 90s. I was starting to try to write it in the 90s, and I tried to sell it to some mainstream publishers, and they all were afraid of it. And one publisher, an editor I respect at a major publishing company, told me, he said, I believe a conspiracy was involved in the Kennedy case, but we can't publish a book like this because you criticize the New York Times so much, and we need them for reviews, and we can't, alienate them. And that's the kind of problem that restrains people from delving into things. And a lot of people know better, but they're afraid to get into it for a variety of reasons.
It's not always, like you said, the intelligence. It's not always CIA. Sometimes it's capitalism, And we've done shows too about. It's amazing how even Department of Defense has so much influence in the TV shows we watch, even on TV shows like American Idol and Cupcake Wars, and it's right there in the credits at the end of the show. You could see, thanks to the Department of Defense. Into the night. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
A couple of books have been published about that. My friend Dave Robb, who's a very good investigative journalist in Hollywood, where I worked for a long time, he wrote a good book on the cooperation that goes on between filmmakers and the Pentagon. Because, if you're making a movie that deals with the military, it's very expensive to try to, if you had to rent ships on your own and equipment and all that, it would be prohibitive. And so they make deals with the Defense Department. But then the trade-off is they get to censor the scripts and rewrite the scripts. And that's a real problem. And that's been going on for a long time as well. So they use... soft sell propaganda is one of the most effective ways of propagandizing because people don't realize they're being sold a political line. They think they're being entertained,
Top Gun. And even, too, I could have, we've had Daniel Hopsicker on the show talking about the Medellin, what was that, the movie with Tom Cruise about the Barry Seal and stuff like that, and how that was so controlled in his opinion. But into the nightmare, my search for the killers of John F. Kennedy, killer of President John F. Kennedy and Officer J.D. Tippit. Why is the murder of Tippit so important?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, two things. Well, first of all, I had a mentor, Penn Jones Jr., who I admired a great deal. He was a feisty small-town newspaper editor, owned his own newspaper in Waxahachie, Texas, which is right outside Dallas, about 20 miles away. And he would write, he got into the case early on. He said, I didn't believe it was a conspiracy until the Sunday. That's how naive I was, Penn said. But he broke a lot of stories that weren't being covered by the media. The media just kind of stopped reporting on it after the first few weeks. They just were passively printing leaks from the government. But Penn was out there doing the old-fashioned shoe leather journalism and hunting down witnesses and things that were contrary to the official story, and he collected his pieces in a series of books. But he told me, and he told other researchers, he said, take one aspect of the case, one that hasn't been covered enough, and research the hell out of it. And that's what I did with the Tippit murder, because I was convinced that there was something very fishy about it, and it was very undercovered. Again, my antennae go up when the Warren report hardly dealt with the Tippit murder at all. He was shot about 38 minutes after Kennedy in a suburb called Oak Cliff, and that's where Oswald lived. And Oswald was blamed with that murder. I don't think he did it, but he fled to, Oswald was fleeing to a theater there, and when a policeman is killed, that takes precedence over everything. I talked to a Dallas policeman about that. Even the murder of the president, suddenly everybody's frantic. I heard that police radio tapes, when Kennedy is shot, they're kind of blasé even, and very matter of fact and unemotional. But then when they say an officer was shot, suddenly everybody gets very frantic and emotional, and the pace picks up, and everybody rushes out to Oak Cliff, and it helped drain Dealey Plaza of police resources, for one thing. But I asked Jim Lavelle, who was the detective in charge of the Tippit case, and he was one of the people who interrogated Oswald. I said, was it true that, people got much more excited when the policeman was shot? And he said, oh, yeah, and he made a little laugh, and he said, well, the saying around there was... I said, how did you regard the murder of the policeman? He said, of the president. And he said, the saying around there was, it ain't no different from a South Dallas N-word shooting. And he used the N-word. I mean, that was pretty shocking that he, they were a lot of racists, KKK members, a lot of corrupt people in the Dallas Police Department. And so the Tippit murder really galvanized a lot of police activity, and Oswald was captured. And I could tell you what I think was supposed to happen, but things went awry. But the Warren report and the media and the Dallas police and the DA's office used the Tippit killing to convince people Oswald had shot Kennedy, and that's not really logical. That if he shoots a policeman, let's say, it could be unconnected with the Kennedy case, but the backward logic was, well, he was fleeing and he shot a policeman, he must be guilty of the murder of the president. And that actually convinced a lot of people. But, the logic is not there. And Lavelle and District Attorney Henry Wade, who I interviewed as well, he gave me a really good interview, they both indicated that on the first day, Captain Will Fritz, the head of homicide, told them to make a case on Oswald for killing Tippit because they didn't have much of a case at all on him killing Kennedy. And I said to Lavelle, well, why did you have a better case on Tippit? And he said, well, we had witnesses. And I could go into that. That's an important part of the case. But they really admitted they didn't have a good witness on Oswald shooting Kennedy. There was one man named Howard Brennan who claimed he saw a gunman in the sixth floor window of the book depository, but at first he refused to identify Oswald at a lineup, and then he changed his mind, and he claimed to estimate the height of the person, even though if you go in that window, if you shoot out that window, you have to be kneeling, and so there's no way you could estimate the height of the person. So that's a fragile reed to hang it on. And there were a lot of problems with Oswald's case. For example, another researcher, John Armstrong, has proven that Oswald never owned a pistol or a rifle, even though they claimed that he did. And just many, many problems trying to link Oswald to the Kennedy case. But Lavelle there were about 9 people who identified Oswald for shooting Kennedy, and about 10 witnesses identified 2 people or a different-looking kind of person, or a person who got into a car, etc. And then there were several witnesses who couldn't identify anybody because they were a little late on the scene. But it's a real Rashomon thing, like the Japanese classic film Rashomon, where people give different versions of the story. And so I spent a lot of time trying to sort out the witnesses. And one thing you find out is the people who identified Oswald, several of them, there are problems with a lot of those witnesses. For example, the lineups that were conducted, they had 3 men from the Dallas Police Department who looked a lot different from Oswald. They were older and they were dressed differently. Oswald was disheveled and he was wearing a T-shirt and he was bruised up, and it was pretty obvious who they wanted people to pick. And even so, some of the witnesses wouldn't identify him, and the person who was closest to the shooting, a guy named Domingo Benavides, who was driving a pickup truck, and he was right across the street. He pulled over, and he wouldn't identify Oswald. There was another guy, Warren Reynolds, who had a used car lot nearby, and he saw somebody running from the scene, and he wouldn't identify him as Oswald. And then a couple months later, he was shot in the head by some intruder at his car lot and miraculously survived. And then he said, oh, yeah, it was Oswald. He got the message, And so that kind of thing happens. Benavides, 3 years later, or actually 4 years later, he gave an interview on camera to CBS and said, yeah, it was Oswald, But in the interim, his brother had been killed in a barroom shooting. His brother looked a lot like him. So there was a lot of intimidation. Witnesses died.
Well, now, sometimes that bullet can jog your memory, too, if it hits the right frontal lobe there.
Yeah.
What about Frank Griffin? I had Frank Griffin on the show. What would you make of his story?
Was he one of the Warren Commission people? Or?
Good question. I don't remember, but he was on a scaffold, I believe, and he says he saw Oswald do it. Shoot Tippit.
Oh, yes. Oh, those fellows. Yeah, there were some workers in the neighborhood. That's right. Well, some of them were pretty far away. He and his colleagues, I believe, were about a block away, and they saw some guy running away from the scene, and it was so far. That's right, Frank Griffin. I was confusing him with Bert Griffin of the Warren Commission. Griffin, his testimony doesn't amount to much because he was too far away. And so there are a lot of anomalies. For example, they found a wallet at the scene that they claimed had Oswald's identification. He had an alias, Alex Heidel, right. And but they also claimed that they took a wallet off him at the theater when they captured him, and it had the 2 identifications, and he wouldn't say which one he was until they got him down to the police station at 210. They arrested him at 152. They really didn't know who he was, but there was this mysterious wallet that was found. What kind of a killer would drop his wallet at the scene of a crime? That's pretty crazy. Things happen, but that's hard to believe. And so it's hard to link Oswald to the scene. And I go into great depth into the nightmare on all the anomalous evidence. One thing that's very important, the ballistics evidence is critical in any case, and there was an FBI expert, Cortland Cunningham, who testified. He seemed like a very honest expert, and he was saying he could not link the bullets retrieved from Tippit with Oswald's supposed revolver that they took off him at the theater. So if you can't link the bullets to Oswald, what kind of a case do you have? You have to rely on witness testimony. And there was another writer named Jerry Rose who in the 80s had a very interesting theory. He said that it looked like Jack Ruby might have set up the Tippit murder scene and staged witnesses there who were connected with him. A lot of the people turn out to have connections with Ruby, who lived a couple blocks away. And a couple of them, though, testified in ways that didn't help his case. And a crucial thing about the murder is the Warren Commission said it took place at 1:15, And the reason that's important is Oswald was seen at his rooming house at 104, apparently waiting for a car or a bus, and a police car had pulled up outside his rooming house while he was inside and honked the horn a few times. And so Oswald was there at 104, and he was 9/10 of a mile from the Tippit murder scene. And if it was 1:15, he could have made it there fast walking. Nobody saw him walking or running to the scene, but other evidence indicates Tippit was shot around 108 or 109. He apparently tried to make a call on his police radio at 108, and some witnesses think the murder took place as early as 106, so there's no way, he could have made it there in time. And I interviewed a man named T.F. Boley, who was driving by right after the shooting, and he was the only person who looked at his watch, and he said it was 1:10 when he pulled over. He was driving with his daughter. He pulled over half a block away and went to see what was going on, and it was 1:10. And there were two ladies who lived at the corner house there, and this is suburban Oak Cliff, and they came outside when they heard the shots, and they said policemen were already at the scene, and according to the official story, policemen took a considerable time to show up, but there were already policemen there, and other people saw policemen, and a couple of witnesses saw a police car in the driveway. Tippit pulled up his car for whatever reason, and people debate that. He pulled up his squad car in a driveway, blocking a driveway between two buildings, and there was a police car in the driveway, which was an alley, and some witnesses said they saw a man come from the police car and shoot Tippit, and then when he fell, the man advanced on him and shot him again in the head to make sure, and then went back to the police car, and the car pulled back from the scene. So I think Tippit was driving into an ambush, and I could give you my thoughts why that happened.
Okay, we're talking to Joseph McBride, and the book we're talking about is Into the Nightmare, My Search for the Killers of President John F. Kennedy and Officer J.D. Tippit. Now, clearly, you have an encyclopedic knowledge off the top of your head on this Tippit situation, minute by minute. My God, we're going to have you come back, and you can talk on this for hours. Let's start with this, though, man. Who was Tippit, and what was his involvement? What's the motive to want to kill Tippit? Who was Tippit?
Yeah, that's another thing that's very interesting. It struck my antenna again. When they don't report on something, it makes me wonder, and he's such an important figure, and the Warren Commission seemed not to be interested in him. And I found a memo by a woman named Alfreda Scobie, who was one of the lawyers working for the commission, and she was a protege of Senator Richard Russell, a Warren Commission member who was skeptical of the official story. And Scobie was very smart, and she wrote a memo to J. Lee Rankin, the head of the commission under Earl Warren, and she said, the Tippit murders seems to be an important part of the case. How come we're not looking into it? So then Rankin contacted the FBI and asked for an investigation, and about a week later they turned in a 19-page report, but it was pretty bland. It gave sort of, some facts on his family and his job situation, but it didn't really say much, and that's about all they did, aside from asking some witnesses questions. And then even the House Select Committee on Assassinations, which came along in 1978 because people were dissatisfied with the Warren report, they did some more digging into Tippit, but they raised more questions than answers. They raised some very interesting loose ends. And so I thought, why is this case not being studied? And there was an unpublished monograph by Gary Muir in 1971, which was good about anomalies in the case, but it was unpublished, and so I thought that's very odd. Here's a big component of it. As I said, the significance for the public is mainly that they use that as a backward kind of proof that Oswald shot Kennedy, which he didn't do either. But Tippit was an undistinguished policeman who had been on the force for 11 years. He was kind of a good old boy from rural Texas who wasn't very well educated and apparently not very bright and not a terribly good policeman. He had never been promoted in 11 years, and he didn't have a lot on his record. He had shot to death a suspect in the 50s And he was generally a kind of a nondescript policeman. But one thing they tried to claim was he was a great family man. He had 3 children and his wife, but he was cheating on his wife. And I interviewed his mistress around the time of the assassination, Johnny Maxie Witherspoon. She gave me a very candid interview, and there was she got pregnant around the time of the assassination. She realized she was pregnant. And she had a baby in the spring of '64, and some people thought that was Tippit's illegitimate child, and she told me it was not, because she said that Tippit had a vasectomy, which nobody had ever reported before, and her estranged husband, Steve Thompson, she said, was the father. But there are people who believe the woman who was born in '64 was Tippit's daughter, but he was cheating on his wife, and he had other mistresses, and he had a couple of other jobs as a security guard at a theater and at a diner, which was frequented by a lot of the far-right people in Dallas, Austin's Barbecue, which was near the police station. And he also had some real problems. He was a World War II veteran, and he suffered from what we call PTSD now. He was traumatized by paratroop training when he jumped out of a plane flying too low. It really scared him. And he went over to Europe in the waning days of the war. He was a machine gunner, and he came back, and he had problems. For example, he couldn't look people in the eye because of his trauma, and the police records show that they were worried about that, because that could be a fatal thing for a police officer. If you're not looking carefully at people, somebody can get the drop on you, which is partly what happened, apparently. And so he was an anxious kind of guy, and he also was financially overextended. He owned 2 homes, which is odd because his salary was only $435 a month, but he owned 2 homes. He rented one out, and he came into some money in the summer of '63, and he bought his father a pickup truck, and he bought himself a new car, and took his family on a vacation, etc. And so things were happening around him. But he was working at Austin's for 3 years, and many of these right-wing guys, Bill Alexander, who was a deputy DA, extreme right-winger, would come in there, and other people, and the Austin cook, who I interviewed, knew General Edwin Walker, who was a far-right general who Kennedy had fired, and a lot of policemen came through there. And Jack Ruby was tangentially connected with the barbecue because Austin's business partner was Ruby's business partner, too. And so Tippit moved in that milieu. He didn't leave much of a footprint in terms of political activities or anything like that, but so there were a lot of things. It seemed like the Dallas police really didn't want to know what happened to Tippit. They dropped the case basically when Oswald was shot 2 days later, because they claimed, well, we have our guy, which is not a good reason to drop a case if an officer is shot. I was surprised if your fellow officer is shot, you owe it to him and your colleagues to solve the crime, and they dropped it like they didn't want to hear about it. And they admitted to me part of it was there were these unsavory things about Tippit that would have come out, and they were trying to protect his image, to make him seem like a very upstanding policeman.
Well, they didn't come out anyway. So they still didn't come out. That's how you came along, right? Real quick.
The House Select Committee in the 70s revealed some of these things, and they did interview Johnny Maxie Witherspoon, and some of that came up. But people weren't paying attention much to the Tippit case, so I thought it's a ripe subject for discussion. Sylvia Maher did what I think is the best book on the assassination, called Accessories After the Fact, in the late 70s, and she really destroyed the Warren Commission by pointing out all its flaws. And she said Tippit was unknown and unknowable, and that was the state of affairs back then. I thought, well, this is too important to be unknown and unknowable, and there's a lot of evidence on all of us. I did a biography of Frank Capra, and I was amazed at the amount of paper trail we all leave you can, if you track it down, it takes a lot of work sometimes. But I'll tell you what I think was happening with Tippit. At 12:45, he was given an order to patrol Oak Cliff, which is 3 or 4 or 5 miles from Dallas, and be at large for any emergency that might appear, which is an odd thing to say to an officer far from the scene of the shooting of the president. And he and his partner Nelson were singled out for that. But Nelson went downtown. He seemed to disobey the order. What was that all about? But I found out that Tippit, first of all, he was out of his district by several miles. And the guy who was assigned to that district was a man named William Menzel. And I interviewed Tippit's father, Edgar Lee Tippit, a nice old fellow. He was 90 years old at the time. He was still working on a farm in East Texas, very desolate area. He seemed very honest, and he said he felt terrible when Oswald was shot because he said, he wanted to know the answers to what happened to his son. But he told me that when Tippit was murdered, he went to Dallas to see the widow, Marie Tippit, and she told him that a policeman had come to her to explain what happened, and this was Menzel, that they were told to track down Oswald in Oak Cliff. This was very shortly after the assassination. And Menzel said, I got into a car accident, and I didn't make it to the scene, and J.D. got there and got killed, and I feel really bad about that. But, okay, so I looked into that, and Menzel claimed that he was having lunch, and then having lunch after the word came out that Kennedy was shot, which is kind of odd. And then he went out, and there was a car accident that, according to the police radio, took place 2 blocks from the Tippit shooting right around that time, and Menzel was sent to it, and he went there and cleared the scene in 4 minutes. It was a minor accident, but how could you write up a report and interview people in 4 minutes? It doesn't make sense. I suspect he may have had a fender bender on the way, but it's disguised as somebody else having an accident. And but J.D. got there, and he drove into what I think was an ambush where he was killed by people coming out of that police car, one person, and there was another person in the police car. And that jives with some of the witness reports. And so that puts a very different spin on it, because they claim they didn't know who Oswald was until 2:10, but by 1:45 or earlier, Tippit and Menzel are told to track down Oswald. The police knew who he was and where he was. They knew where he lived, so they assumed he was going to go to his rooming house. And they had a kind of a red squad who were following, dissidents, and Oswald had defected to Russia, and his politics were confusing, but they knew his address, and so they sent these guys to look for him, and they didn't, it wasn't said what they were planning to do with him, whether they were going to arrest him or shoot him. I believe they were probably sent to shoot him, because in the theater, it looked like they were hoping to have a fracas in which they could shoot him, and then they would have looked like geniuses to solve the case within about an hour and 20 minutes. But he started shouting, "I'm not resisting arrest! I'm not resisting arrest!" And so he got, he survived, and they pulled him out the front door. There was a mob outside, and they whisked him down to the police station. But as Dwight MacDonald, the famous critic, said, Oswald's miraculous survival for 48 hours in the hands of the Dallas police before he was shot in the police station, surrounded by about 60 policemen and a lot of press people.
Yeah, held up by a cop that doesn't flinch an inch when the gun starts going off.
Jim Lavelle is the big guy in the white suit, and he does flinch in that shot, but Captain Fritz is leading them along, and he seems to walk ahead of them, leaving a big space between him and Lavelle, who was handcuffed to him, and Oswald. And Jack Ruby got into the police station. The story of how he got in doesn't hold up, and a lot of researchers think that an inside contact in the police force let him in. because he was sort of the mob's bagman for the police department. He knew all the policemen, and he was giving them money and girls and all kinds of stuff.
Okay, so Joseph McBride, we only have about 10 minutes left. Now, what about, I had another guest come on recently who did the JFK to 9/11, Everything's a Rich Man's Trick, Francis Richard Connolly, and he had a theory that Tippit was a look-alike for JFK, and that was going to be part of the whole, you've heard of the body swap stories and the open casket and all that stuff too. A lot of shady stuff went on there too, but who the hell knows at this point? Was he a look-alike for Kennedy, first of all?
No, not at all.
Okay.
I mean, one of the things that got me going was another omission I noticed in the Warren volumes. There were only two pictures of Tippit. One was 1952, and then the other was 1957. And I thought it was odd there wasn't a more recent picture of him. And he didn't look much like that. The autopsy photos, which came out, showed him as older and more weathered looking. He was rather thin and wiry. But I think they didn't want people to say, "Oh, I saw that man, doing this and this." Right. A couple of things he did that were very suspicious right before the shooting. He was racing around Oak Cliff trying to find Oswald, and he pulled over a guy named James Andrews, and he blocked his car, and he ran over and looked in the back seat, and there was nobody there, and then he took off again. This was just a few blocks from where he was killed. And then he went to a record store on Jefferson Boulevard, the main drag there, and he ran in and commandeered the phone and made a phone call, and then he just stood there and listened, and it's not clear if he heard anything or if there was nobody there, and then he raced out again, and there were good witnesses to that, and then he took off in his police car, and then the next thing was he was killed. So he was doing something. He was chasing Oswald, and the question is why he would do that. He was obviously part of the plot if he was given these clandestine orders at a time when the police claimed they didn't know who Oswald was. And why he was part of the plot, that is speculative to some extent. It could be that he needed money and he got paid off to do this job, or to accost Oswald or bring him in or shoot him. And he knew all these right-wingers who saw him in uniform, on weekends, keeping order at this drive-in frequented by teenagers. But he may have had some other role in the plot, and I examined that too. There was one of the pictures in Dealey Plaza shot by an amateur shows a policeman or a person in a policeman's uniform firing a shot from the concrete retaining wall on the grassy knoll very close to where the Kennedy car was. And I've seen pictures of that man blown up, and he has a very distinct notch kind of look in his hairline, which is very unusual.
Are you talking about Badge Man?
Badge Man, yeah. Okay. He had, that's what people call him.
Yeah.
He had this look, and Tippit had the same notch. He had receding hairline, but he had this kind of a notch in his hair. But the problem is, he was seen at a filling station across the viaduct from Dealey Plaza. You can drive there in about 5 minutes, depending on traffic. And he was sitting there waiting for something, and 5 people saw him. And he was waiting for a bus. Oswald was supposed to show up in a bus, and he wasn't on the bus, so Tippit took off. And so he could have been in Dealey Plaza, but his widow gave him an alibi that she claimed he was home for lunch that day, and then he left when the word came in the president was shot. But her story has changed so many times over the years that it's an open question whether he really was there for lunch or not. And I tried to interview Mrs. Tippit, who died recently, but she didn't respond to my letter. And then I went to Dallas for the 90th birthday tribute to Tippit at the Sixth Floor Museum, and Mrs. Tippit and her surviving children were there, and I went up to her, and she seemed like a nice lady, and I said, I'd like to come and interview you tomorrow if I could, because I'm in town. And she had a police minder with her who was kind of, stuck close to her, and this guy came over and interfered, and he said, well, give me your information and I'll call you. Of course, he never did call me, and it's like he was blocking her from talking to me. And then I started talking to Curtis Tippit, the officer's youngest son, and he was a very nice fellow, and we were having a good talk, and this same police minder saw this, and he came and literally yanked him away by his arm, pulled him away from me. So they protected Mrs. Tippit so she wouldn't talk very much, but she did talk to J.D.'s father, who nobody had interviewed except the FBI did a brief interview with him in 64. But he was an untapped source, so that's what I tried to do, is find people who hadn't talked before or hadn't talked as extensively as Mrs. Johnny Maxey Witherspoon did to me, for example. And I found T.F. Boley, who hadn't been interviewed.
Well, let me ask you this. Back in 62 in Texas, cops had partners. They had two-man cars, right? Did he have a partner?
Well, they did for a while, and then they kind of let that slide for a while, so officers often did go out alone in cars.
Really?
Tippit and Menzel had been partners, driving around together, and then at the time of his death, he was supposedly partnered with a fellow named Nelson. But Nelson wound up going downtown, contrary to the order, and some people wonder if some of these orders were doctored on the police radio tape, too, and that's another. So everything about the assassination is complicated, and you can't take any piece of information at face value or any witness statement. You have to back it up with other sources, documents, other witnesses, and that's why the research took such a long time. It's good discipline for a researcher to have to, triple check everything, but that's what I did.
Well, we've only got about 4 minutes left. In that time, like what haven't I asked you about Tippit that you want the audience to know?
Well, a good question would be, what's happened after my book? A good researcher, Jim DiEugenio, who wrote the new Oliver Stone documentary on the case, said we live in the post-McBride age in terms of the Tippit murder, and what he meant was I advanced the case, and what I hope to do, as any scholar will do, is advance the subject so that other people will be interested in following up. And to my pleasure, a number of researchers have been digging into it. And I have a list of suspects that I discuss in the book, and I exonerate some, and it's all tentative, but I talk about some people who might have been involved. There was a criminal who was connected with Ruby who was suspicious and was around that area in that period. But there are a couple of names that have come up. There's Kenneth Croy, who was a reserve officer, and Officer Westbrook, who was a desk officer in charge of personnel, who were both on the scene suspiciously quickly and ahead of the time when the official account has policemen there. So some people are focusing on the movements of these two officers as being people who lured Tippit into a trap so that he could be killed and implicate Oswald or give a reason to kill. When there's a cop killer on the loose, the policemen are ready to shoot. And so there's a lot of research about these fellows, Croy and Westbrook. What was Westbrook doing there as head of personnel, and he was not in a uniform or anything. As I mentioned, the two ladies at the corner house came out of the home when they heard the shooting, and they said policemen were already there, very suspicious. And so hopefully there'll be more and more people building on my research, and that's what, I've opened up some avenues for people in this hitherto neglected part of the case. And one reason I dug into it, David Bellin, who was one of the Warren Commission lawyers, said the Tippit murder was the Rosetta Stone of the case, and he meant if Oswald shot Tippit, he shot the president, which is, fallacious. But I think it's the Rosetta Stone of the case for other reasons. If you could crack that, it helps to shed light on what else was going on, and that's one reason I did that.
Joseph McBride, we are out of time. Thank you so much. We actually skipped the whole mid-break. You're on such a roll, man. I couldn't bear myself to interrupt you. Joseph McBride, Into the Nightmare, My Search for the Killers of President John F. Kennedy and Officer J. Tippit. I really encourage you to follow up on Mr. McBride's work here. Political Truth, the Media, and the Assassination of President Kennedy. But if you go to his Amazon page, and I hate supporting Amazon, but What are you going to do? And you follow all of his books. You follow him. There are 24 different books on Hollywood, Orson Welles. This is incredibly great stuff. I'd love to have you come back and just talk about Orson Welles, John Ford, Steven Spielberg, and talk about these different topics one night. Come back, Mr.
I'd love to. That'd be great. Yeah, that's my sort of day job, and I've had this dual life as a film scholar, film historian, and also Kennedy assassination researcher, and so I have a lot of interest in, but the assassination is something I'll be studying my whole life, and it's a fascinating subject. But I hope people read the two books with an open mind, and a lot of people have. I think the younger people, I think, have a more open mind than people of my age. I'm a baby boomer, and it used to be when you bring up the subject, people would get very nervous and they wouldn't want to talk about it. But my students, for example, they're all fascinated by it, and they approach it without prejudice, and they just want to know the facts, like Sergeant Joe Friday, the facts man.
Joseph McBride, thank you so much. Good night.
Thank you, Ed. Great talking to you.
Bye.